Hey everyone, this is going to be a video in response to TonyaTKO, where she basically asks people to tell her whether or not they're living at the moment the sort of life that basically they would like to. I'm going to be giving quite a long and involved answer to this question. I'm going to be talking about some things that are a bit difficult to talk about, mainly because I've had quite a lot of abuse in terms of communicating with other World of Warcraft players in particular lately, and it's started to make basically any form of self-disclosure a lot more difficult. I mean, people say that, I'm just emo and I'm hypersensitive and I ought to get over it, but I've basically discovered that pretty much anything that you say can and sometimes will be used against you. I guess at this point this is just a risk that I'm going to have to take, because I do need to talk, I think, about some of these things. It'll also give the few people here who care a bit more actual insight, I guess, into me as an individual as well. Anyway, my answer to Tonya was initially going to be, whether or not I'm living the kind of life I want to. The initial response was going to be no, overwhelmingly not. But the thing that I thought about it, and then the thing that I realised is, I'm sorry, hang on a sec. Yeah, I'm back. The thing that I realised is, to be honest, I don't really know whether or not, I don't really know what it is that I want, because, the way things are at the moment, I initially had a plan, basically, of what I wanted, but that was sort of back, to be honest, in the mid-1990s. Of course, and we're in 2008 now. Anyway, what happened was, back sort of in the early 90s, my parents were involved with Amway. They became Amway distributors. I don't know whether, well, most of you I think probably would have heard of Amway. Anyway, one of the things that Amway does, or did, was to try and motivate people to want to adopt an extremely affluent and materialistic, and I'm sorry, I'm not looking into the camera, I can't all the time because it's virtually impossible to do with the way it's set up here, so most of the time I'm probably not going to be looking into it. I am sorry about that, but I'll put it more in a place where I can, but now of course it's out of the light, so it's going to be largely audio only. Anyway, so we got into Amway, and one of the things that Amway does is to encourage people to want an extremely wealthy, affluent, opulent, entrepreneurial type of lifestyle. And I basically, to a degree, adopted that, and I got into that. I was born into a scenario where my parents were initially better off than sort of they ended up being, and so for a while it basically just seemed like a fairly logical thing. Well, we were possibly going to continue basically being fairly well off. Anyway, a lot of that basically changed in 1995. At that time, we'd been living for 7 years in a house, a very nice house, a house that we'd only built at the beginning of that 7-year period in a suburb called Berwick, which was in the southeastern the outer southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, but which was a much more, or somewhat more affluent, and I would say intellectually oriented part of the city than where I'm living now. And we lost that house. The primary reason why we lost the house is because my father was, at least from what I saw, my father was spending more money on motivational materials from Amway, to the point where he actually wasn't able to afford to make the payments on the mortgage. So we had to move out of there, and after about a year in limbo, living with relatives, we moved to a much smaller and older house in a much poorer part of Melbourne than that one. And this was actually the most poor and, I would say, probably least educated area of Melbourne that I'd lived in at all in my life up to this point. I'd gone to a private school for 3.5 years, and I guess we'd just basically been around a much more, I don't want to say intelligent, but I guess that's part of it, and a much more wealthy, basically, sort of community of people. You know, I think one of the worst things about this particular house was, the new house, we found out that the last people who'd been living there had actually been using it as a marijuana processing plant before they'd fled from the police. If that gives you any idea of just what a huge shift in neighbourhoods this basically was. So yeah, that was the first thing that we had happen, and we lived in that particular house up until 2000. Then in 2000 we moved out of that particular place and into another, probably even more dilapidated place than that. I was nearly killed at one point in 1998, I think it was. I went out, I was out at about 3 or 4 in the morning, and I walked out to a local milk bar, and anyway, on the way home there were a couple of people following me, and one of them basically started throttling me. And I mean, the only reason why I'm still here now is because they decided to let me go. I mean, there was no one around, there were no witnesses. They would have been able to kill me and probably get away with it. So that really shook me up quite a lot. I became very reclusive and introverted after that point, a lot more so than I had been. Then, of course, in 2001, we had, well, the Americans know what we had happen. We had September the 11th. And I know a lot of the Americans watching this are probably going to wonder, well, why would September the 11th affect me so much? I can tell you right now that there were a lot of people in Australia, myself included, who were enormously, adversely, psychologically affected by September the 11th. Part of the reason for that, I believe, is the degree of closeness that exists in the, I think, both political and cultural relationship between Australia and America. Our two countries, I think, are very close and have been very close. There was, of course, that initially started with the ANZUS Treaty, which I believe was drafted at around the time of the Second World War or shortly after that. We were involved in Vietnam, of course. So there was not only was there I think a sense of solidarity in the country, but there was also, it caused us to develop an extremely apocalyptic mindset. I can remember I was actually in the sitting room. It's one of those, what they say, of course, the moments where you always remember where you are. And I was in the sitting room of the house that we were living in at the time with my father. And we'd actually got Foxtel not very long before this. Foxtel, of course, was actually the first cable or network television pay network television service that I know of anyway that had become available in Australia, and we'd only fairly recently got this at the time. So we were sitting there watching Fox News, and we saw the footage of what was going on. And I can remember at the time, I don't know about Dad, but at the time it was a very humid night as well. I remember that. And of course, I don't know how familiar people in the Northern Hemisphere are, but, you know, with the seasonal differences in Australia being in the Southern Hemisphere, but September, of course, is our first month of spring. And it isn't normally, I can remember it being an unusually humid night for spring. Normally the humidity comes in, I think, a bit later, or sort of in the summer, but this was it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, I think. It would have been early morning here. The time that, when I say early morning, I mean it was morning in America, but it was daylight in America. Over here it was, I think, sort of about 2 or 3 in the morning. And at the time I was engaged in a largely nocturnal lifestyle, as of course I still am now. I actually live on something probably closer to Pacific Standard myself in that regard. It's not really anything intentional, but I basically just became largely nocturnal. And so, yeah, we were watching when that happened, and I, of course, at the time thought that I was probably looking at the opening shots of the Third World War. I'm sure that there were probably a lot of other people who had that sort of attitude as well, that this was basically what was happening. So for a period of probably about, the other thing that I had happen, and this was all in the mid-late 90s, I had probably half a dozen people in the extended family die of cancer. I had at least 2 people suicide, and I also had an uncle convicted on, well, I don't know whether I should specifically go into the nature of the charges that my uncle was convicted with, but suffice it to say that he was sentenced to 10 years in jail for crimes that involved several other family members as well. So that was extremely traumatic, particularly considering that that particular uncle was probably the one member of the extended family on my father's side who I was actually closest to. So that was a huge blow for me. Then in 2003, I met a woman who I got into a relationship with for 5 years. This particular woman ended up being the means for me to leave home. Up to this point, I was still 25 or 26 years old. I was still living with my parents, primarily due to a number of different reasons. Might as well admit this, hadn't actually lost my virginity at that point. And this particular woman was basically the only means that I was looking at for basically being able to leave home. So even though I'll admit I actually wasn't as deeply into the relationship emotionally as I thought, it was an opportunity that I basically took. And I left home and I moved in with her. Now, part of the reason why I wasn't able to actually commit emotionally to that relationship fully was because in the previous years, while all this other traumatic stuff was going on, I'd basically developed a number of very strong long distance or online relationships with, I would say, probably 3 to 4 different women, primarily women from America. There was one woman in particular from Texas who I developed an extremely intense degree of emotional feeling for, to the point where when this other woman came along offline, there actually really wasn't anything emotionally there left for her to a large degree. Anyway, we moved in. I moved in with her, and something else that I did, which I'm really not proud of, I basically slept with her in order to try and secure my situation, because I'd basically been booted out of home. I was living in a building that was separate to the main house, a bungalow, and my father had basically just come out there one morning and essentially gone berserk at me. And I'd basically just said to him, because of the degree to which he had done this, that I wasn't prepared to put up with him doing that anymore. And he basically said, well, if that's the case, you need to get out and basically go somewhere else. And I know that at the time, the only real reason why he did that is because he knew that I'd become involved with this woman. And therefore, basically, I had somewhere else. So anyway, I moved in with this woman, and yeah, I wasn't in love with her, in hindsight, at that time anyway. I tried to force myself to believe that I was, and I ended up sleeping with her, basically in order to ensure that she didn't end up getting involved with someone else while I was living there as a roommate, and therefore forced me to move out, because I basically, at that point, thought that my parents had essentially abandoned me. As I said, I'd had the number of other people that I'd had die. I really wasn't feeling as though I had anyone at all at that particular point in time. So I was basically flailing around, treading water, trying desperately to basically just secure my situation, I guess. And I did. I really shouldn't have slept with her. I really shouldn't have done that. I should have just remained as a roommate. But because I was scared, basically, extremely scared, I did it. So we got into an emotional relationship, and I lived in that house for probably another 2 years, until 2005. And I eventually got to the point where I just couldn't stand that at all anymore. And so we moved into the house. The ex-girlfriend and I both moved into the house that I'm currently in now. And initially I'd planned to only come over here on my own and to actually leave the relationship and to not invite this particular ex-girlfriend to move in with me. However, at the time, she ended up needing to leave the house as well, and given that she wasn't in that much better of a economic situation than I was, I made the incredibly poorly considered decision to basically ask her if she wanted to move in with me. And she did. And so the relationship continued from 2005 for probably another 2 years, until reasonably late 2007 or mid 2007. It's been probably about 12 months now since she actually left. I went through an extremely bad period after she moved in here. I went through a period basically where I just didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't think, I basically thought that I'd made the one final effort that I could to leave that relationship and get out on my own, and that had failed because of the fact that she was with me even in this place. And I basically just thought that I was going to be trapped in that relationship for the rest of my life. So that went on until, I would say, probably about April 2007, around that sort of time. And at around that, in fact, no, we're probably talking earlier. We're probably talking late 2006 for the incident that I'm about to tell you about. Around that time, I found a particular video which had been produced by a user, actually on YouTube, called The Friendly Geek, who put out a video called The YouTube User's Guide to the Friendly Geek. I watched this video, and I'd been watching a number of The Friendly Geek's other videos. The Friendly Geek was someone who basically struck me as... he was basically living the type of life that I had envisioned living for myself, even during the period when we were in Amway. He seemed to have quite a lot of money. He wasn't monogamous at all, and I'll admit that. He was actually quite promiscuous. But he really seemed to be getting an enormous amount out of his life, and he really seemed, from my perspective anyway, to be enormously and genuinely self-actualised. And he put out this video, as I said, the YouTube User's Guide to the Friendly Geek, which sadly I can't show you because it's since been removed. He removed it. But basically what that video caused me to realise was, this was a guy who basically had everything, or it seemed like anyway, this was a guy who had everything that I'd wanted for my own life. He was living on his own. He was well off. He, it seemed, could basically have pretty much any woman he wanted. And he was really happy. And not only that, he was demonstrating that he knew that happiness, human happiness, was pretty much the only thing, and self-actualisation in that sense, was pretty much the only thing that was worth living for. And that was something that, this basically reminded me of the fact that I used to think like that myself. He was also travelling, which is something else that I basically used to want to do, never have done. Don't know whether I actually ever will do at this point, but anyway. So yeah, I also actually had another incident not long after that, which is basically going into theistic territory. I had grown up Christian. One of the main reasons why is because my father, as he got older, developed progressively more and more of a fundamentalist Christian stance, and so I had ostensibly not only referred to myself as Christian in order to placate him and a number of other people, but had actually very actively tried to be Christian and go to a number of churches and integrate myself with a number of different youth ministries, most of which actually fell apart during the time that I was in them. I eventually had to leave Christianity because of, on a number of occasions, Christians expressed a fairly extreme degree of fear and intimidation of me. They referred to me as, they didn't refer to me as a monster, but the last thing that the last person I ever knew, affiliated with formalised Christianity, who used to be a good friend of mine, actually said to me, and this was in 2007 I think, was that he believed that I'd become Satan's property. So I basically left Christianity. I'm no longer Christian. And I went through probably about a 6-month period after that, feeling literally completely alone. Aside from my ex-girlfriend, the only other two people I knew offline at that point were my mother and my youngest brother. I didn't associate with anyone else in the family. I wasn't talking to my father, and I'm still not, because of the number of things that happened. And so I was completely alone. During that time, I do believe, and I know that this is going to be met with skepticism by people who hear about it, and I've probably gone into this a little bit before. During that time, I had a particular experience where I was approached by someone who I initially wasn't able to visually identify, but on looking up online, basically the physical description, basically just this completely jet black. And when I say jet black, I don't mean in an African sense. I'm talking black woman, also with the hair in a particular configuration. The physical description basically matched this artwork that I'd started finding online of this particular Hindu deity, who I now know to be the Hindu goddess Kali. And that was a fairly mind-blowing thing for me, because I honestly didn't know anything about Kali at all before that point, and I can honestly say that I had never seen any of Kali's artwork at all before that. I don't think I'd even really heard of her at all. So yeah, I basically had the initial, I don't know whether vision is the right word, but if you want to call it that. I know that sounds arrogant, and I don't want to, but there was the initial encounter, and then there were a couple of other things as well. And yeah, basically what I ended up concluding was that this could be part of a new path for me, in the sense that I was essentially, or I guess, hang on a sec. Okay, I'm going to have to be a little quieter now because my housemate's back. But basically as I was saying, basically the interpretation that I took from that was that even though I didn't really feel that God in the Christian context had rejected me, I basically felt that Christians, as a specific human group to a large degree, actually had. And that basically what I was being told by being approached by Kali was that where I'd been rejected by them, I was basically being accepted by her. And that was, at the time, that was pretty important. That was something that I think I actually really needed. I'm going to admit to some stuff here, I guess, and when I say that, I guess I just did then. That's probably going to make you think that I'm really emo, basically, and fairly pathetic in a lot of different ways, and that's cool, people do think that. Anyway, yeah, so that's that. And look, I know that there are going to be some atheists. I've spoken about this before, and I know that there are going to be some atheists who, if any of them watch this, are going to put comments on it along the lines of, "Oh, you're deluded. Stop believing basically in God at all. You know, you're just a follower, you're basically moving from one thing to another, da 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 da. And that's great, that's fine. I'm not really bothered by that. And the reason why I can say that I'm not really bothered by that is because I realise that there are a lot of atheists who are basically very threatened by theism, are extremely threatened by it. There are atheists out there who basically feel that atheism is never going, as a belief system, is never going to be totally secure for as long as theism exists. Now, that might be true for as long as Abrahamic or Semitic monotheism, specifically, that is Christianity, Judaism and Islam, as long as those three exist. That might be true. However, look guys, I'm going to say this, maybe I am delusional, and it's very possible that I am, and I'm conceding that, okay, yeah, it's a possibility. I possibly am just nuts, flipped out. But I would ask that as long as my particular delusion, if you want to call it that, doesn't threaten your ability to believe in whatever you want, and it doesn't, because I really don't care about what other people believe, I would ask that you basically please extend me the same courtesy. Don't try and convert me to atheism on the basis of feeling that you're doing me a favour. I mean, I'm sure from your perspective you are, but realise also that if you try and do that, you're not really being any better than the Christians when they basically do that to people. Okay? And that is something that I want to say there, because in some of the other videos where I've mentioned Carly, I've had some comments from some atheists where they basically did feel that I was someone else who needed to be liberated from theism, for my own good, of course. You know, I needed to be saved. I've got to ask guys, does that sound at all familiar? Because, yeah, to me it sort of does. I think there was sort of this other group that basically used to do that. You might remember who I'm talking about. Anyway, so that was that. And these two events that I mentioned, the introduction to Carly and the video from the Friendly Geek, they basically happened within 2 or 3 months of each other, I think, or let's say 4 months. And so I was just sort of pretty dazed by that. I mean, it was as though I'd sort of been given a 1-2 punch, you know, so I was just sort of going, whoa, you know, like this. Anyway, I got over that, and I basically realised, okay, I need to get out of this relationship, and I need to get my life back. I had to really push hard for that. Really, really, really hard. I had to really fight hard. I had to make my ex feel that continuing to live with me was just completely unbearable, because to a degree I think she genuinely did love me. I mean, my mother went and saw her again just the other day, and Mum said that she'd said to her then that she loved me. But here's the thing, my ex smoked. She was a very, very heavy chain smoker. We're talking 3 cartons of, and I think a carton was 4 packets of cigarettes each per fortnight, and that was after she'd actually tried to cut down a bit, and each one of those packets, they were 50s, I think. And out of a disability support pension of probably $250 a week, I was spending probably $120 a fortnight or $60 a week on cigarettes. Now, I was doing that before rent, utilities or food or anything else was paid for. Sheena's cigarettes got paid first. In fact, they would get paid for normally literally within minutes, sometimes at 3 in the morning, of when the money basically went into my account. In addition to that, I have, at least to a slight degree, been afflicted with loss of eyesight, long-range eyesight, which I believe was actually due to being subjected to huge amounts of cigarette smoke for 6 years. To say nothing of what, I mean, I don't know what the other effects might be on my long-term health. And I basically tried to tell her about this at one point, and she basically said to me that she would leave me before she quit smoking. And you see, when she said that, I can remember that after she said that, something actually changed. When she said that to me, something changed, and I started to basically think, well, if you can say that to me, that means that you don't really love me. You might try and claim that you do, and look, I'm not going to claim to be any sort of authority on what love is, on what constitutes love, on what love is. I don't claim to be at all. But I do know, or I do think anyway, that it's basically not that. You know, I mean, to me, that is not a statement that someone who loves a person would basically make. God, this hair, I've got to cut it. Yeah, and I know the hair is really bad. I've got to go and get it cut. I just basically haven't had the money to a large extent. Yeah, so that was basically that, and I realised, okay, this relationship. Not only that, I've since bought another bed base, but for several years I was living on an old mattress that she'd basically given me, which had ended up being sprayed down with insect spray at one point because I had a heap of spiders basically getting on it, and yeah, and that was really bad. Basically white-tailed spiders. I've now got another bed base which I was able to buy, but yeah, there were just a lot of things about that scenario that were really, really bad, you know, and I'm glad I've got out of it. What else was I going to say? Yeah, so I guess that's basically it. I mean, this is where I am at this point. I'm out of the relationship. I've got a new housemate. Yeah, and at this point, basically all bets are off. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't believe at this point that it's very likely that I'm going to be able to get into another relationship. I found out while I was in the relationship with my ex that, or I believe I did, that there are a couple of reasons why I don't feel as though I am or would be particularly desirable to another member of the opposite sex. And those are things that, they're not things basically that come out sort of in the first couple of conversations, if that makes sense. I've been talking on here for ages, and I know because I've had to get a lot of this out, and this is going to be a long video. I haven't uploaded anything for ages because I haven't really had anything to say, so I guess this is going to be a time where you'll be able to hear sort of a lot from me. But yeah, to answer Tonya, no, my life isn't really completely the way I want it at the moment, but it's probably actually closer at this point than I have ever been, and I'm hoping right now that I can use where I am at the moment as a basis to essentially start moving towards it basically getting a bit better. Yeah, and I've done a couple of things basically to try and start the ball rolling in that regard, but I'm not really sure what's going to happen there yet. We'll just have to see. I do want to try and stay in contact with a few people. Tonya, you are wonderful. You really are. I'll talk to everyone soon.